All right, we're live. Assalamu alaikum. Imam Khalid, how are you doing?
Wa alaikum salam rahmatullah. Alhamdulillah, I'm doing good, Brother Musab. How are you this evening?
Alhamdulillah, can't complain. As always, I'm really excited to, have this conversation with you. Usually these conversations are just over the phone, but now, we're broadcasting. So,
Okay.
so uh,
Yeah, the
I'll
wonders
be a
of
little bit more,
technology. The
yeah,
wonders of technology. Yeah.
yeah, I'll be a little bit more careful with my words and my questions to you,
Okay.
inshallah. So,
Inshallah.
I think I was talking to a few people, and it was really enlightening how some of the discussions that we've had over the last few conversations we've had, just because there's no rehearsal, and you just something triggers, and you just give us a history lesson. So I think that's
Hmm.
uh, one of the really cool parts of this dynamic. So there was something that I was something that was on my mind that I want to discuss with you. As Muslims, the way that you had described, I think it was like the first time we were talking on here, and I asked you, just imagine we're back in 1974 in DC, and you're a young student, or you're a young dawah worker on the streets, and how would you? I'm walking towards you. How would you talk to me about Islam? And you used the pitch that you gave was there was an emphasis on liberation and freedom and revolution and freeing your mind. Um, I think that there's a obviously I think those principles, liberation and mental freedom, these are things that I think inclined to these are things that appeal to everybody, every human being. But I think, would it be correct to say that for you particularly, or someone in your circumstance as an African American in the United States growing up in the South, that was uh, that was a lot more important to you? Would you say that was, why was it that you had this, why you gravitated towards the liberating aspect of Islam?
Yeah. Musab, I think that the, as you aptly described, the just overall conditions of growing up, having grown up in the southern part of the country. As Malcolm used to say, there was up south and down south. And so I grew up in down south. And at a kind of young age, I had developed a consciousness about what was really going on beyond me, outside of the high school setting, and what was going on in the local environment. And because of that understanding, I realized that the problems that we were having in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, were not unique to Winston-Salem. As a matter of fact, there were much worse conditions as far as inequitable distribution of wealth, poor housing. There were other areas in the country, particularly amongst African American people, who had a situation that was much more dire and much more intense than what I had in Winston-Salem. So the idea that Islam would be a force that could liberate our bodies and liberate our minds was very appealing, because I truly believe that, I thought then and I believe now, that there needed to be a mindset change of African American people. The movements that were prominent at that time, the civil rights movement, and as it was moving into the Black freedom struggle phase of the movement, of the civil rights movement, were very instrumental in raising the overall awareness and consciousness and sensitivity of people of African descent. But by the same token, the majority white community in this country and North Carolina and in Washington D.C., as it was manifest through the government structure, it was really a need for a liberation of the mind of even the majority white population in the country at that time. the like what's going on in Florida with this Joker DeSantis, who's trying to just completely erase the history of not just Florida, but of America itself, of the whole existence of African people in the Western Hemisphere. The white folks at that time needed a liberation of their minds too, because they were just as restricted and they were just as narrow and distorted in their thinking as the oppressed population. So Islam came to me on the set as a very liberating force. I think I may have mentioned it in another discussion. I can remember traveling in Brooklyn, New York, when back in the 1970s, and looked up as the car turned the corner and saw this gigantic billboard with the visual of this African American with a nice beard and a little afro, and he had chains wrapped around his head. And what was on that billboard, the wording was, "It's Lincoln freed your body, Islam frees your mind." And so I thought that this message of liberation was just so powerful that particularly when I was talking to African Americans or Latinos, but also with members of the white population at that time, there was this need I felt for their minds to be liberated as well. All of the false historical notions that they had ingested and internalized over the years was helping them to continue to look at certain populations as being inferior by birth, by nature, by mentality. And this was something that would impede that population individually and collectively as people and as a majority of the ruling class uh, in the government. This would impede their progress to be able to make changes, necessary changes in the society.
That billboard that you were referring to, was that Darul Islam? Who put up
Yes,
that billboard?
yeah, to my understanding, it was the Darul Islam that put the billboard up, and it was before cell phones, and I didn't typically walk around with a camera. So I couldn't take a picture of it. I mean, had I been able to just capture that, I think I would have used that uh, in publications and just different things that I was writing at the time, but just didn't have that quick access to a camera at that time.
I think that and this is the reason why I feel like we really need to as Muslims, as a Muslim community, the necessity for communicating and hearing other people's perspectives, like your in terms of your age group, your family, presumably, I mean, you're African American, so your ancestors were enslaved, right?
Yes.
How far away from you, like how many generations away from you did that, like, was the last person enslaved?
Yeah, it was not far at all, as far as the my personal knowledge about who was actually enslaved in my family. Uh, and the one that really I knew about because I've been hearing stories from my father from a little child was my father's grandfather. So this would make it my great grandfather was an enslaved African in Southern Virginia, and he lived to be about 108, 11. You know, they weren't keeping very good records at the time, so of particularly of the African population, and he lived to be at least 108, and he died in the early 1930s, like 1932, 1933. It's even some uh, question in the family, even the exact year that he died. But he was over 108 years old, and he had lived through the horrors of enslavement, but he had also had years on earth in which alive where he was not enslaved. And so he was able to give a very unique perspective, pass it on to his son, my grandfather, and then to my grandfather and my father sitting around listening to these stories, he passed a lot of that on to me. And so it sort of set something in my heart, in my mind at an early age about the horrors. Never mind what DeSantis is saying about all of the skills that Black people are learning. I mean, it's just insulting and just an insidious kind of characterization of what slavery was all about. But it started something. It set something afire in my heart that how can human beings treat other human beings like this? I mean, how can a population of people who obviously were not just capable of learning, but were excelling in so many areas. I mean, people in my family, people around me, I mean, folks were, it was obvious to me that we were people who actually had a soul. We were people who had a functional brain. And genetically, that just didn't happen after enslavement. But through my readings and through my studies, I realized uh, uh, and read so much about these glorious African empires before enslavement. And so, at a relatively early age, uh, I started to signal the history of people of African descent long before the period of enslavement. And never mind what they were teaching us in the school system, but because I read a lot and tried to read almost anything valuable I could put my hands on at a young age, uh, I got scolded and maybe sometimes even punished for some of the views that I uh, had come up with. I'll never forget. This was in high school, in my U.S. history class, and I went to an overwhelmingly majority white high school because it was before the desegregation of the schools in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And the coach, not the coach, I'm sorry, the teacher in this class was also the basketball coach. And, had I thought that I would go on and play at this predominantly white school, he dis he just made me understand that no, I'm not going to go through all the rigors of training and all this other stuff and put on a jersey and I'm representing and I'm struggling and I'm fighting against friends of mine who are going to these majority segregated Black schools. And that was just not going to be me. But this history teacher, who was also the varsity basketball coach, this guy penalized me every step of the way because of my perspective of history. And he actually told me that it's not your job to reinterpret what you're being taught. Your job is to give back to me, just basically regurgitate the information I'm giving you. And I couldn't do that. And I'll never forget, there was a section on the trade labor movement in this country, and he had a very negative attitude about unions. And so my father, all I remember my entire life about my father was he was a trade unionist. And he was a union organizer in the Deep South. And he used to come home and tell me all these stories. And I was just so fascinated by this stuff. So we were on a section in U.S. history uh, at this high school. They called this high school Society Hill. And I was shocked. I was talking to a young man the other day who actually went to the same high school, and he told me even today, all these decades later, the school is still referred to as Society Hill. And this was because uh, the children of the privileged class in Winston-Salem, this was the primary high school that they went to. So you had all these, big business owners, children, and RJ Reynolds relatives, and all these folks who were at the school. And then you had this small population of African Americans like myself. And so I had to, and I'm sorry to get so far off on this story, but I had to get my father to come to the school because the guy gave me I think it was a C in history because of how I just wouldn't adhere to just letting him open up my head and pour junk in it. I refused. I didn't want that junk. And the dude gave me a C. And and the grades came out around the time we were talking about the uh, labor unions. And so my father said, "Okay, I'm gonna come to school with you, and I want to talk to this guy." So my father came to the school. He didn't come and show out. He didn't threaten the man's life, anything like that. Uh, but he explained the the dimension of unionism and what it meant to the labor force in the United States, even up until that time. He explained it in a way that the guy who needed his mind liberated asked my father to come back and give a couple of talks to the class, which he did. And so after my father came in, he kind of, well, not kind of, he backed up off of me, and I was happy for that. But so I'm just going back to this whole idea about the need for liberation of the mind, and this is what Islam does for every human being, no matter what their station, class, everything else, what their race may be. Is the most liberating force that a human being can have. And and I just, my rebel kind of attitudes about things when I was young, I think that Islam gave me an outlet where I saw, well, maybe you're not so crazy and just a rebel. Maybe you are going in a good direction.
The thing is that, and you've made mention of, you've referred to Florida and some other states that are trying to remove uh, aspects of Black history. And I think that, I mean, that's obviously one issue. And then also, it's just generally in the community, you'll hear certain things about, it's so long ago, slavery so long ago, right? And uh, we can all obviously talk about the fact that no, look, something that exists for hundreds of years has repercussions that last a long time, and the whole reincarnation of that unjust system. But it's really important for us to know that, people like you and your generation, and so many of these Muslim brothers and sisters who have served the community for 40, 50 years and then passed away, many of them were probably in a situation similar to you, where you, as you mentioned, you were related stories from your father who spoke to a person who was actually enslaved in this country, his grandfather. That's not that far back. I
No, it's
mean,
not at
that's,
all.
you were in contact one generation away from you, right? And then
Yeah.
I know that uh, for those who know that you live in a library. a, a, por- a
That's
portion of your home is, I mean, that's a high
right.
compliment, by the way. That's high praise.
Yeah, my
And
my wife my wife has never accepted the fact that she's living in a library. Right.
and it's a very, very good selection of books. And there's one of your bookshelves. I think you were on a meeting one time, and I was just in your living room, and I saw there was like, I think 7 or 8 small booklets, and they were I pulled like 2 or 3 of them out, and they were actual people who were, I think it was, maybe it was when they were still enslaved or shortly after, and
Mhm.
someone just sat down and like transcribed them talking about their lives.
Mhm.
And I had never, I mean, in all my high school, college, and it's studying U.S. history, I'd never read that before, and I
Mhm.
don't think that that's widely available. What and the thing is that as time goes on, more and more generations, you have grandkids now, as each generation moves further away from that, tragedy, I think we become desensitized to it. And
Yeah.
the we don't even realize that we do need liberation still, despite I was never enslaved, and my ancestors, I don't know if any of them were, but
Right.
I still need liberation, except I have the illusion of freedom and the illusion that I don't need that. what can you like can you relate some maybe lessons from since you were able to talk to your father who had a direct connection? Is there anything like shed some light on that? What can we
Yeah,
learn from that experience?
yeah. It was uh, it was really crushing in a way when my father first started talking to me about what his grandfather had gone through in slavery and as an enslaved person. And I mean, some of the emotional impact of that, I think, stayed with me even to this day, because, as you said, it was a first person narrative that was passed on through the family. And something else about my grandfather, my great grandfather, um, when he was staying with my grandfather and my father and his family, um, they said that he had such a hatred for white folks that he would sit on the porch with his cane, on the front porch with his cane, and you would have white people coming in the neighborhood selling insurance and you know vegetables or some whatever it may be, and they would always have to keep an eye on my great grandfather on the porch because if he saw one of them, he would come off the porch with his cane and try to beat them, literally, no matter who they were. If they were white, he would try to beat them with his cane. And so uh, my father told me that people in the neighborhood thought that Papa George was just this old Papa George, just a crazy dude, man. What's wrong? With your talking to my grandfather. What's wrong with your dad? What's wrong with your grandfather? He's just a crazy guy. But if in fact he were crazy, which no one in the family believed that, um, he was so damaged by that experience of chattel slavery that so much of his life was spent in that he just and he couldn't process, and it was only natural to, after having gone through the experiences that he did, was to, in my he wasn't Martin Luther King, and Martin Luther King, it was a long time before he came along to try to instill in African American people in this country that love could overcome wickedness and all this bad behavior. So you love your enemy. This is the Christian way to do it. Just love them, love them, love them. But Papa George he didn't have the benefit of that teaching. So he did what I feel would be a kind of natural response for folks who are not just submissive to the oppressive conditions under which they're living. One other little historical point about those slave narratives that I have in my house, uh, is these, most of the ones that I have all together that you saw at a certain section of my bookshelf, these were all transcribed from a program. I guess it was during the uh, uh, Roosevelt administration, second Roosevelt administration, the second person named Roosevelt who was president. Um, and these, he established during the Depression what was called the Works Progress Administration, and this was an attempt to give Americans jobs. I mean, it was during the Depression, and it was really, really bad. So he created a number of entities in different areas. Like if you were a writer and you're out of work, your paper closed down, or whatever you did, he gave people an opportunity to have dignity, to continue in a certain way their professions. So part of this Work Progress Administration was this effort to talk to people like my great grandfather who had been enslaved, who were still alive, and to try to capture some of that first person narrative experience. And so uh, I have to, now when I'm describing this writers project, everything has been digitized, and the Library of Congress has a list of every single person with the narratives. I just have 7 at the house, but this was a big operation, and I want to go through with the almost the hope that I would see my great grandfather Papa George name and his relating some of his experience through this. But there's nothing to me. It's like free your mind and your body's gonna follow. And this is something that was so attractive to me about Islam itself, because it didn't just ask me and require me to have a purely emotional attachment in my faith. It required me to think and to study and to reflect, as the Quran was. It's just throughout. It's just telling us to just ponder what's going on, what's in front of you, and so I think the importance of and it's one of the concerns, and I'm going off point here, but one of the concerns that I have um, about uh, the younger people, and I'm not like an old fogey cracking on young people, because I'm energized by young folks like yourself and others, and all my adult life in some capacity or another, I've worked with young people in the public school system at Wake Forest University. I've my entire adult life I've worked with young people, and so uh, it troubles me a little bit sometimes to see the um, you can acquire information in a lot of different ways, and I understand that. But the tendency today, I think, is to get away from uh, getting a substantive understanding of different topics, whether we're talking about, liberation of people, whatever it is. It's everything is at the cliff notes. Everything is it's a short take, and because of the short take, a number of our younger folks are going away with just a piece of information, thinking that this is all I need. I don't have to read all that stuff. I don't have to listen to all that stuff. I got it. 15 seconds, 20 seconds. Check Google will give me all the information I need on the subject. And I think this is, uh, I'm not anti-technology. I'm trying to keep up with stuff, even AI. Trying to keep up with it. But I think that the more we use our own initiatives to delve into just any topic, anything, it will the human capacity for this information, true information, to lead us back to a law is increased, is enhanced.
Well, on that note, let me ask you this. Given your background, that you're coming from, your upbringing, everything that you've experienced, you mentioned before that you were in the South, but and there were other places that probably were worse, right? At least you weren't in Mississippi and stuff
Right.
like that.
Thank Allah. Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah. But you had, I mean, you were clearly, you came from an educated family, and you had access to information. I'm sure you uh, you had access to the church and to, you know, uh, Judeo-Christian literature. I'm sure you came across Marxist type literature and other things like that. What was it about Islam, and specifically about the theology, the creed, that appealed to you from a liberating perspective? Like, why was, because I mean, I know in Christianity they have a field called liberation theology. Marxism was based on the proletariat overthrowing the bourgeoisie.
Hmm.
But you arrived at Islam. What was it about the Islamic creed or the Aqidah that appealed to you from a liberating perspective, that made you select this over the others? And I don't, Allah is the one who guides, but
Right.
I'm asking from a, a rational, logical perspective, what led to that decision?
Right, right, right. You know, I had just, as I was nearing the end of my high school years, I had just started reading at that point about scientific socialism and Marxism and this kind of thing. And when I went away to college, um, I had access to a much greater, wide array of not just reading about, but coming in contact and talking with people who had ideological leanings that I could hardly find in North Carolina. You know, when and I'm sorry to make this long, but I can remember when my senior year in college, and I may have mentioned this before, so I won't spend any time on this. But my senior year in college, I was involved in an effort to organize the Black students at the high school to walk out of school, and everyone walked out except for two African Americans. And you know how they must have been stigmatized probably for the rest of their lives. Still remember these two people for being the only ones in the school who didn't walk out. But one of the very active members of this organizational effort was a neighbor of mine. And this neighbor, we grew up the street from where she lived in the neighborhood. And she's a very brilliant young sister. And, she went into academia after a stint with the Communist Workers' Party, who in 1979, November 1979, five members of the organization were actually shot and killed by members of the Klan. And kind of long story, but after this event of organizing in the Reynolds, the Black students at Reynolds High School, there was a communist white guy. I think he was an academic. He was probably teaching in one of the colleges in the area, who started to identify individuals like my friend who grew up down the street from me and myself, and talking to us, trying to help us understand what Marxism, Leninism was all about. And he wasn't just publicly, nobody would publicly identify him if they didn't know that that was his philosophy. And my friend actually um, became I guess, a communist. There's no other way to put it. And on that day in November in 1979, she was actually in that a part of the Communist Workers' Party, and she was actually shot. She was about 8 months pregnant, and she was shot in the stomach. Um, and alhamdulillah, her baby didn't die, and she, recovered from the wounds. She jokingly told me a lot of years later that the problems that she was having with her son, who she was pregnant with at the time, she said a bullet must have hit him in his brain, the way that he was acting and not doing the things that she would want him to do. But I say all of this to say that, um, and then because of that um, being in the leadership of this walkout at Society Hill at the time, there were a number of older activists, African American activists at the time, who came and met with me and others to try to give us some direction as far as our life journey and this kind of thing. And so, as whereas my friend that I grew up with followed this communist route because of exposure at that time, I wasn't ready at that time to accept an ideology that did not have God as I understood at that particular time, at the center of it. I just, my Christian background was such that I just wasn't ready for that. But when I went away to school, I realized that there were so many different branches of alternative ideologies to capitalism, and so at one point, I think actually before embraced Islam, I considered myself an African socialist, Julius Nyerere of Tanzania. There was just so many folks that I looked to for ideological and struggle inspiration. And I think the expression "the die being cast" kind of early. It and But then once I was in school in D.C., I went to a lot of communist meetings, Trotskyites, Marxist Leninists, just all kinds of folks. Um, and I got up close and personal with a lot of the individuals and these study circles and this kind of thing. But as I said, I think it was just my, Southern Baptist upbringing that, I'll say this, add this too. I'm reading a new biography right now of Dr. Martin Luther King, and it reveals some information that out of stuff and information that I already knew. It's some new information in it. It's a very good biography. And I was surprised to learn that part of his journey to get to the point where he was in his Christianity and on that path was that he had Marxist friends and he studied that when he was in college. I mean, not as a class, but he really put time into trying to understand uh, this alternative to this Western style capitalism. And so uh, I was on a similar kind of track with that. And I'm by no means saying this to compare myself in any kind of way to any illustrious figures like that, but I'm just saying that a similar path, Allah guided me to Islam and guided uh, Martin Luther King, who was such a brilliant person and knew all these philosophical teachings and Marxism, Leninism, all that stuff. But he was anchored in Christianity, and because his father's a minister and all this stuff, he didn't move from that. Uh, and so I'm so grateful that Allah guided me to Islam because of such a complete system. It was like a one-stop deal. I didn't have to try to struggle to try to identify a theology and then try to find an ideology. Allah just put it in one package in Islam. And I think that a figure like Malcolm X, Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz, has been so attractive to not just African Americans, but just talking about his attraction to African American people. The words that he spoke prior to becoming Muslim, taking Shahada and becoming Muslim, September 1964, he had his official on paper Shahada at the big Islamic center there in New York. I think at that time it maybe I forgot what street it was, 110th or something like that. And he has his documented Shahada. Uh, and so he is so attractive, in my opinion, because that theological direction is melted just perfectly with the ideological direction for struggling people of African descent and struggling people of any descent once the veils are lifted from the mind. And so it's kind of going back to free your mind and your body is going to follow. And, Lincoln freed your body and Islam frees your mind. So it's Islam uh, is in a package with individuals like Malcolm that so many years, maybe 58 years, I think it is now, of his martyrdom in an Audubon ballroom, people are still excited when they learn about this person. And what was so attractive was not his being some kind of mealy mouth, um, I don't want you to, I want you to think good of me. So I'm going to say what's acceptable and I'm not going to hurt your feelings. And he never deliberately tried to hurt anyone's feelings, but Allah gave him the courage of his conviction to speak a word of truth to power and to the powerless. And he was not going to compromise in the positions that he took. And so I think that as Muslims today, and I'm going through a lot of stuff and I'm getting off point, but our Muslim community today would truly benefit, I believe, in the environment in which we live, the conditions under which we are struggling now, to revisit this the personage of El Hajj Malik El Shabazz, Malcolm X, not just from his oratorial skills, not from that standpoint, but from the standpoint of how he embodied what Islam demands of each and every Muslim man and woman to take a stand against injustice and oppression, to not just be absorbed into into Americana to the point that our identity as Muslims gets subsumed under our pursuit of trying to develop this I'm a good person too. I'm a good American too. And what I see and what I've seen for so long as a Muslim in this country, that this attraction of Americana that this society gives to those Muslim, Christian, Jews, atheists, that if you just leave us alone, don't criticize us, don't point out the contradictions, and just get absorbed by this, your culture, your religion, your direction, get absorbed by this gigantic sponge called America, because America has the capacity to absorb any and everything. And all of the Muslims, that millions of Muslims that we have in this country today, our impact becomes nominal when we just get absorbed by the sponge of the United States and absorbed into the culture, absorbed into the aspirations of the mythology that is presented as to what this country actually represents, right? And so I think that is essential, not just for people of descendants of former slaves, enslaved descendants of former enslaved people, but it's essential for all Muslims if, in fact, we are to have an understanding how to navigate all of the pitfalls, navigating around these pitfalls that American culture and just the society itself has to pull us away from our Allah given mission as Muslims, to invite the people to Islam, to stand up for justice, to speak a word of truth, all of these manly and womanly qualities that Islam calls upon us, that unless and until we adapt and embrace the kind of attitude about America, the perspective, we are going to get absorbed in the sponge of America, just like every other culture and people have been absorbed into the sponge. Give the folks certain things, give them honorary white citizenship. We'll allow you to do certain things as long as you don't uh, deviate from the mold that has been cast for people in America and in the society today. And I apologize for going off on that
No,
rant.
That was no, that was really good, alhamdulillah. And what I gathered from that was that I mean, well, there was a lot of things you said, but one of the things that you kept on coming back to was to struggle and to struggle to struggle. And you were saying that the ideology and the theology in Islam was one and the same.
Yes.
And I mean, I think we could talk about that much longer because I know that some of the I will save that for next time.
Okay.
That you and many of your peers from the Islamic Party had certain sayings and mantras, and they were very reflective of what you were saying regarding the need to struggle and to fight, to
Mm-hmm.
dedicate your life to this. And yeah, I think what we'll do in one of these in the next month or so, maybe we can get some of your friends to join you on here so that we can
That
hear.
would be great.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we'll
that
do
would be
that.
great.
With the few minutes that we have left, the this tradition we've started is like story time and
Uh-oh.
your you know the the eventful life that you've been blessed to live.
Mm-hmm.
Um there's a there's a personality that many people in the Muslim community, in the Black community, African community feel strongly about, for or against.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to know, like, if you could, from a historical perspective, maybe from an autobiographical perspective, if there is anything there. But
Mm-hmm.
here, let me
Mm-hmm.
go ahead and let me go ahead
Well,
and
here we go. It's almost like a game show, you know. Yeah, it's like a game show. Okay, now who's next?
oh, where'd it go? There we go.
Now, why did I not think that either this week or at some week you would not have the picture of Muammar Gaddafi, who was the president of Libya until I think it was 2011, when U.S. forces and European forces, French and others, were involved in his assassination. Um, I had the opportunity to be in his company and to meet him briefly in July 1976 when I was in attendance with the Amir of the Islamic Party, Yusuf Mazafardin Hamid, um, in his company at this Zionism Racism Conference that was sponsored by Libya in July of 1976. And, you know, Gaddafi has been so demonized in the West. And, uh, and I think that from American imperialist perspective and standpoint, is for good reason, because he stood for certain principles of justice and I'm not trying to gloss over any excesses that he may have done with the Libyan people to stay in power as long as he did. I think he came. Uh, uh, he was a colonel in the military, and in about 1969, they overthrew. I think it was Idris, who was the king there in 1969, and he was the man until 2011 when he was was martyred. Um, and but Gaddafi um, was a figure that a very complex figure, but from the standpoint, and he moved, in my humble opinion, in 1976 when we were there, um, and in his presence, and listening to him through translations, uh, Gaddafi was an individual that took a very uncompromising stand against Western imperialism. And at the time that he was killed, he was assassinated. He was rallying the many of the countries on the African continent to move away from the dollar, US dollar, is a medium of exchange, of international exchange. And he wanted to create a singular African currency that would be used not just in Northern Africa, but throughout the entire continent. And so many people feel that this is one of the reasons that his assassination came about, when it actually came about. I saw, and I know we're out of time. I saw very quickly. I saw that um, with my own eyes, many of the positives that he brought about in Libyan society in terms of elevating the educational level, in terms of basically free housing, for Libyan citizens, and turning the desert green, and large swaths of the Libyan desert, supporting liberation movements all around the world, and this kind of thing. He's a very complex individual, and I think that Western and U.S. society has uh, demonized him to the point that the positives that he was doing have been kind of hidden, and folks won't approach uh, to try to understand, what Gaddafi had done during his time.
I've met a few African American Muslims who have told me, like older ones, who have told me that back in the day when the Muslim community in America was predominantly African American, and there were a lot of communities that didn't have resources. This guy, he donated a lot to help build mosques and Islamic centers. Is that something that you've is that very like is that true, or is that some
No, it's
urban
it's
legend?
definitely no, it's not urban legend at all. And I like the point that you made, that at one point in the not too distant history and past of the United States, and the history of the Muslim community in the United States, the majority of those above ground, above board Muslims in this country were, and identifiable, I guess is a better way to put it, were African American. And because of the overall condition of African Americans in the late 60s into the 70s, during the heydays of the Islamic Party in North America before it had relocated to the Caribbean, uh, Muammar Gaddafi was someone that supported many of the efforts of African American Muslims. Uh, Eventually, there was a division. Uh, I forget what it was called at this point, but it was, I'll say it was their religious affairs division in the country of Libya. And they did more than just send Qurans. As you referenced, they actually helped to help Muslim communities across the country. Uh, and a lot of that good work, I think, because of some of the dramatic stuff that Gaddafi may have done in later years as part of his regime, all of that gets lost. And but I'm one who believe, as I think all Muslims should believe, that our affairs, no matter what, how we evaluate what those who declare that they're Muslims, how we evaluate their actions and what they do, their affairs are with Allah. And it's Allah who's going to determine on that day that we all have that meeting whether or not a person's the balance in the scales, which way, based on this deen that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us, which way our scales are going to tilt. And what I'm pointing out is not just like a blanket endorsement of what Muammar Gaddafi did as the leader of the Libyan um, Jamahiriya, this Libyan state, but a recognition that which I experienced and saw and talked to with people with my own eyes, that this was a government under his leadership that supported almost every liberation movement in the country, whether it was in the world, Philippines, so many different liberation fronts on the African continent, just all over the world. You name it's far, what's considered far Asia, far Eastern Asia, and this kind of wherever it was, Gaddafi supported it. And I had the opportunity when I was there to visit some of the almost clandestine offices, unmarked, no signs on doors, and this kind of stuff. So many of these different liberation fronts while I was there in 1976. And, this is, for a person who, you know, had the kind of mentality that I had, this was exciting. This was something that I cherished that experience right up until this very moment.
Did you shake his hand?
Yeah, I did.
Okay. He
I
didn't
didn't
get
kiss it.
the he
I didn't
didn't get
kiss.
the
I didn't
Jimmy
kiss it.
Carter treatment.
No, no, he didn't get the Jimmy Carter treatment, and I didn't kiss his
Okay.
hand. But yeah, yes.
And have you read that book that he's holding?
Is that the
The
Green
Green
Book?
Book?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. It's kind of funny, when I went over there with uh, uh, Yusuf Mazafuddin Hamid, as I said, the Emir of Islamic Party, and also the brother who was the deputy Emir of the Islamic Party, Dr. Kareem Abdul Ghani. So it was three of us, but Dr. Kareem went over as a journalist. So we, were kind of totally in separate areas doing all of the sessions, and we were kind of separated. But um, you know, as I said, he was just a phenomenal person. He was a phenomenal person.
Okay. Okay. Well, that's another. I don't. We haven't come up with a name for it, but I guess it's like guess who.
Right.
So
That's right. Right.
just
Right.
wait till next time. I'll
Right.
try to come up with something even more. I really like seeing your face as you react to it,
Right.
and
Right. Right.
realizing that you might have I might be putting you on the spot. All right.
Right.
Well, this was
Okay.
fun. Is there
Alhamdulillah.
anything
Yes,
else
it
you want
was.
to add?
No, I just pray that something that is said during the exchanges that we have and with the people that we'll bring in as guests, that it'll be beneficial um, to our community.
All right. Well, then with that, we'll go ahead and close this out. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam rahmatullah.